I'm very pleased to introduce the next session, the nuts and bolts of media grant making. So for the next 45 minutes, we'll hear a series of short talks zeroing in on best practices in media funding. First, we'll hear from Sean McKaney of the William Penn Foundation, who will offer insights to funders about editorial independence and transparency. And then we'll turn to Allison Levine from the Delaware Community Foundation, who will provide some practical guidance on media landscape studies. And finally, Leah Trusty of the Democracy Fund will bring us home, sharing best practices for supporting journalism using an equity lens. Let's have a round of applause to welcome our speakers as they come up to the stage.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sean McKaney. I'm with the William Penn Foundation. I'm pleased to be here today representing a local media funding organization. For folks who may not know us, we're a regional, place-based foundation here in Philadelphia. We do grant making of about $150 million a year in early learning, watershed protection, and equitable access to the arts and public space. Our education work is very urban-centric. It's exclusively in Philadelphia. Our environmental work embraces a much larger footprint encompassing the entire Delaware River watershed, 4 states in New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. When it comes to journalism funding, like a lot of funders, we are quick to say, we're not a journalism funder, which, is like being in a 12-step program, but not yet ready to admit you have a problem, right? We make millions of dollars a year in grants in journalism, public interest reporting, but we're not a journalism funder. Well, yeah, of course we are, even though we don't have a formal grant-making strategy in journalism. We make about $2 million a year in public interest reporting, which is a programmatic tactic, right? Very essentially the same as grant-making we do in policy research, advocacy, or demonstration projects. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about how we organized and structured that work without the benefit of the guidelines that might normally accompany like a formal journalism grant-making program. But by way of further background, I'll just mention that in 2009, under the leadership of our president, Feather Houston, the foundation commissioned Jan Schaefer, who is the executive director of JLab, the Institute for Interactive Journalism at the American University, to survey the state of public affairs reporting in our region. And her research confirmed and quantified what we understood intuitively, that there was a real decline in public affairs reporting, about 25% decline in that kind of reporting over the prior decade, owing mostly to the changing fortunes of the media landscape. That research led to a series of recommendations and initiatives that we developed to fill the gap. There was also a period of exploration and learning related to the changing business model of journalism, and as was happening a lot back then, we stood up several new nonprofit reporting efforts to fill specific gaps, all of which still exist, although not necessarily in the same form. And we also briefly experimented with network infrastructure to support independent reporting efforts. This was a major recommendation coming out of Jan Schaefer's report. Ultimately, our board felt that we were not well positioned to tackle the business model question, thinking that there were certainly other people smarter than us who were tackling that issue. So we shifted our focus to filling specific reporting gaps by finding reporting largely through existing media platforms or helping to create new ones. The board recognized, that if we wanted a strong public policy agenda in things like environment and the education, that we had to have strong public interest reporting to support it. So we launched a number of content projects intended to build awareness and public interest in the things we cared about, ultimately making about $14 million in public interest reporting grants over the last decade. So I'm going to highlight some of those in a moment, but first I want to talk about an important flaw in our initial journalism approach that ultimately caused us to pause, stop the work, rethink it, and resume it. Because, as I said, our public journalism was not an independent grant-making strategy, but really a tactic in the service of our other areas of interest, we didn't create sufficient rules or guidelines to govern it. And different grant-making teams were making grants in different ways and in different forms, and there was a tremendous amount of inconsistency in how we were supporting media projects. I think ultimately, though, an even bigger concern that our board came to believe was that we were too close to the work, and that there was a risk we would be perceived as essentially just funding reporting on our own grant-making, and that our work was not funding good reporting in the public interest. So we formed a board task force to look at the issue and develop institutional guidelines around our journalism grant-making. I should say, too, that while this was an issue of the entire board, it was driven by a particular board member who was an editor at the Philadelphia Inquirer, prior editor of the Philadelphia Inquirer. So we had a seasoned newsman on our board, and he was right. We did not have the right guardrails in place to ensure the integrity of our journalism grant-making. So the board task force did three things. First, it adopted a clarifying mission statement for the work, stating, and I'll just read it quickly, the foundation supports high-quality, independent, facts-based public interest news reporting to inform and educate the public and call attention to public policy making, private investment decisions that impact the foundation's core areas of grant making. So that was a mission statement we all agreed to. Secondly, we adopted very specific language in our journalism grant-making contracts. It's a bit granular, but if you'll bear with me, I think it's worth hearing some of it because it talks about where we were getting into trouble. So our journalism grants contracts now say the William Penn Foundation strongly supports and values the editorial independence of public interest news reporting it funds to ensure the independence and credibility of our public interest reporting grant making. The foundation will not support direct reporting on a topic that indicates a point of view or an expected result. It will not suggest or direct interviews with named individuals. It will not request or accept an offer to review any journalistic reporting in advance of publication. And then it goes on to talk about the need for nonpartisanship with legislative issues. The task force also adopted very specific instructions on how to disclose and promote transparency of our grant making, including our name in lists of funders, acknowledgement at the conclusion of articles, and even inserting our name parenthetically in articles that might relate to a potential conflict of interest. And then the last thing was we actually created template language for our program officers to use when describing their work publicly. Now, I realize to this audience, this is probably old hat, right? This is pretty conventional and obvious guidelines, but it was a really important process for us to go through, especially at a time when there was continued skepticism about the role of philanthropy in journalism. And now that we're in the era of disinformation, it's even more important to promote the integrity of privately funded public interest reporting, and it's an issue we're revisiting ourselves again to ensure that we are maximizing the integrity of our work. Another flaw in the work that remains unresolved, and I'll be looking for guidance from this audience, is that, again, because this is not a separate grant-making strategy, we do not have an evaluation and learning program specifically for our journalism grant-making. We measure the results of individual grants using a lot of the typical things that folks use, but we don't distinguish the impact or efficacy of our journalism from the rest of our advocacy grant-making, which includes advocacy efforts, public education commands, and then public interest journalism. So this will be a challenge we'll be dealing with in the future. So based on that intro, I'll just provide a little bit of insights about what we're doing locally. What is a place-based local media funder working on? And to give you just a few examples, to expand coverage and reporting on regional and state education issues, which is a huge issue for us, we helped transform a small parent-led newsletter called the Philadelphia School Notebook into an online news service. The Philadelphia School Notebook started off as a grassroots, literally homemade newsletter by a couple of parents to provide information about Philadelphia schools that was not otherwise available either through the school district itself or the legacy media. Over time, it became a trusted information source that was published a few times a year. With our support, they were able to increase the frequency of publication, expand coverage, and ultimately develop an online presence. And finally, in an effort to promote sustainability, the school notebook was absorbed by the National Education News Service Chalkbeat. And the notebook is now Chalkbeat Philadelphia, the 9th Chalkbeat city. We also fund State House reporting on education issues, and I'll touch on that in a minute. To fill gaps in environmental reporting, we've been funding Yale E360, a highly respected online magazine focused on environmental journalism. Our funding for Yale E360 supports a capacity for reporting in the Delaware River watershed. But despite its affiliation, the reporters who work on that reporting are local folks. They're in the region. Another example of our support for environmental reporting is that we also funded a partnership with National Geographic and the Lenfest Institute. That effort sought to expand photojournalism and environmental reporting of existing local and regional news organizations in the Delaware watershed. It was a really amazing shot in the arm in terms of capacity and technical knowledge for a number of local news outlets. And like in education, we fund State House reporting on environmental issues as well. So finally, as I mentioned, in addition to education and the environment, we also fund more general civic affairs reporting, and that takes two forms: State House reporting and electoral reporting. To fill the gap in State House reporting, we sponsor State Impact PA, which is a reporting project of WHYY, our local NPR station, that's focused on Harrisburg. And as I said, state environmental and education policy, a huge focus for our grant making. And we also support New Jersey Spotlight, which is an online news source focused on state capitol reporting in Trenton that was founded, I believe, by a couple of former New Jersey Star-Ledger reporters that has since been absorbed by New Jersey Public Broadcasting. As an aside, I'll just mention all four of those online news services we started over a decade ago have all either been absorbed by public broadcasting outlets or have been absorbed into national news networks. The other civic affairs reporting we do has been focused on reporting Philadelphia mayoral elections, going back to 2008 with a project we started back then called The Next Mayor, that again was under our president, Feather Houston. The aim of that effort was to ensure that those contests, those mayoral contests, would embrace and grapple with real issues of concerns to the voters and not just deteriorate into the typical horse race kind of elections. Jim Friedlich, who's here, of the Lenfest Institute, I believe, is separately talking about the latest iteration, the exciting, latest modern iteration of that effort, which is just launching in anticipation of the 2023 mayor's race. And we'll cover both the mayor's race and other local elections. And that project is called Every Voice, Every Vote. And we're really excited about that work. Let me just wrap up, I know I'm running out of time, about a specific impact of the pandemic on our media work. Coming out of the pandemic, during which there was tremendous learning loss for school children in Philadelphia, we've been exploring a range of ways to provide supplemental, compensatory learning opportunities. Some immediate things we've done have included summer enrichment programs for 5,000 school children this past summer. But taking some cues from the virtual learning experience, we've also taken our first tentative steps into educational public television. Last summer, our board approved an initial grant of $2 million to HYY toward the development of 2 original educational enrichment television series for preschool children ages 2 to 5 and early elementary children ages 6 to 8. And to support academic skills, the programming will align with Pennsylvania's early learning standards and an evidence-based program called Conquering Kindergarten, which is a curriculum that is well respected. By meeting those standards, that will ensure that the programming helps to support not only academic but social emotional skills of young children and will distinguish it from other children's programming. And to further extend the learning, HYY will create lesson plans for each episode, which can be accessed online and utilized by families, child care centers, and our family child care providers. We signed on for 15 episodes, which we're really excited about. And Philadelphia will be the setting and context. Philadelphia locations and places will be the setting of the programs. But we're hopeful that the content will be valued and potentially distributed to other regions. This is the first time we've done any kind of media funding in direct operational or functional support of a core grant-making strategy. So it's a big step for us, and we're excited about it, and we'll be carefully evaluating and learning from this initial experience. So let me just close by also saying that support for media turns up in other ways, beyond just sort of policy-focused work. For example, we have a big arts education program, and we fund HYY's Media Lab, which is a school-based arts education program for middle and high school students to train the next generation, hopefully the next generation of journalists. I think that's a good place to stop. I want to let folks know that if you have interest in the kind of policies we created for William Penn, I have versions which we can share publicly and be available to talk afterwards. But thanks for your attention, and thanks for letting me join this conference this afternoon.
Hi, everyone. I was realizing as I was sitting there on the front row that we are the after lunch crowd. So if anybody needs a stretch, feel free. I'm Allison Levine, and I'm here today to talk with you about why local news and information ecosystem assessments might be a good investment for you as grant makers or for other funders that you're talking with. For my day job, I am the Vice President for Marketing and Communications for the Delaware Community Foundation, and I also lead our work on democracy there, particularly our work around journalism, which has been my personal passion for most of my life since I was about 10 years old. I also have a side hustle, which is a rather time-consuming side hustle, as the president and founder of the Local Journalism Initiative of Delaware, which is a nonprofit that I incubated over the past several years. We affectionately call this group LJI, so that's what I'm talking about when I say LJI. LJI has a number of work streams going, but I want to talk with you about the first big project that we undertook, and that was a statewide assessment of our local news and information ecosystem. And I want to focus on why funders got excited about supporting this work and how we did it and what it's doing for our communities and how you might look at supporting similar work in your own communities. Oh, and I'm supposed to click my own thing here. Okay, great. I'm remembering how to do this after 2+ years of pandemic life. So I like to kind of do a Simon Sinek here and start at the beginning, start with why. Until I started making noise about local journalism a few years ago in Delaware, our funders didn't really think of journalism as something that philanthropy should support. They sort of thought of it as a for-profit industry with a broken business model, and Gannett and the other guys just needed to get their acts together and figure it out. So we needed to start in Delaware with why does this matter? Why should they care about local news? And it was an education process, and we went through a lot of the same things that Nancy talked through this morning. It was really important to our funders that we look at real research, real data, about what happens when local news goes away and how it affects our democracy and our communities. So we talked about the things that Nancy went through, how government becomes more expensive and less effective, less efficient. We talked about loss of civic engagement, polarization and misinformation increasing, and the exacerbation of inequity, and particularly the impact on Black and Latino communities. So after going through this research, our funders had a real aha moment, and they understood that this is about journalism, but it's not really about journalism. It's about democracy, and it's about community. And that is something that philanthropy cares about. And once they understood that, they were eager to address it. And they were all looking at me for the answers about how to fix it. And they also wanted evidence of what was going to work. Funders, as many of you know, love metrics. But there is no single strategy that is going to fix a community's local news and information ecosystem. That was my dream at the beginning of this work, is that I would suddenly discover that if only we could start a Delaware News podcast or a Delaware News YouTube station, we could just fix it and it would be fine. But it doesn't work that way. People get their information in lots of different ways, and they need lots of different things, and they want to consume things on lots of different platforms. So we determined that the first thing we needed to do was to ask the community about what they wanted and needed from us, or excuse me, from our local news and information ecosystem. So we set out to do a statewide listening campaign about our ecosystem. And our funders really recognized the value of getting our arms around the community's needs. So we were able to pretty quickly raise the money to do this. And this is in a state that really had done pretty much zero funding for local journalism previously. A lot of folks have asked me about what it actually costs to do an ecosystem assessment. And it's hard to say because I've volunteered a lot of my own time to it, but our best estimate is pulling in volunteer time and all the numbers and actual things that hard cash, we think it costs about $100,000. So Delaware is a small state with fewer than 1 million people. So for us, the whole state can kind of be studied like a single metro area. I know Delaware communities really well. I've lived in Delaware about 24 years, and I worked at the newspaper to start. I worked in local government, state government. I worked private sector and nonprofits, and I've been in philanthropy for about the past 11 years. So I understand Delaware and our communities, and I understand our news and information landscape pretty well, but I had no idea how to do a listening campaign. I didn't know how to gather that kind of information from the community. So I needed some external perspective. So I partnered with Fiona Morgan, who, as many of you know, is a nationally recognized consultant who specializes in listening to communities about their news and information needs. Fiona and I recruited a team of diverse local researchers from all over the state. And we also called on Outlier Media, which, again, many of you know, is a BIPOC-led nonprofit news service organization based in Detroit. And they helped us to run a statewide text message survey and an analysis of local data resources like 911 and 211 and other publicly available data sources. So as a group, we engaged 269 Delawareans in our research over the course of several months. We conducted 35 in-depth one-on-one interviews, all about between 30 minutes and 90 minutes long, depending on how much the person was excited about talking. And we also held 8 focus groups. This is a screenshot from one of them. That's me up in the top left there. These focus groups were co-facilitated by people from all different communities throughout Delaware because we wanted to make sure that we were talking to people from lots of different walks of life with lots of different perspectives, political points of view, ethnic backgrounds, different life experiences. So we found different people throughout the state to help us to bring in folks from different communities into these focus groups. So through the focus groups, we ended up talking to about 85 people, and that included folks ranging from hairdressers and physicians and teachers and mechanics and engineers and lawyers and more. One group we did not talk to in depth was journalists. This was really important to us because this research was really about trying to understand what the community wanted and needed and not what journalists thought the community wanted and needed. So that was really important for us. And finally, Outlier helped us to do the text message survey, which helped us to get insights from a really random group of people. And we made a particular point of oversampling in certain communities and certain geographic areas where we know we get less engagement from folks. So the result of the study was a 70-page report with a lot of findings. Since we only have about 12 minutes here together, here are the 3 biggest takeaways from the Delaware assessment. First, Delawareans really want and need local news and information. They are just downright hungry for it. I think that mirrors trends around the country. They need information in 3 key categories. They need information for functioning. They just need information on how to get the kids registered for school, when the ramp on I-95 is going to open, what is that giant Walmart-looking building down the road that's going to be opening soon, and are they going to be hiring? So functional stuff. Social connection. Delaware is a pretty resource-rich state. We're lucky that most part, not 100%, but for the most part, if people need to get their basic needs met, they can do that. But they're having a hard time making social connections. And we heard that really loudly and clearly. People are looking for a way to build the social fabric, and they don't know how to do it. And the third big way is civic engagement. Delawareans desperately want to participate in our democracy, and they want information about what's going on before decisions are made, before it's too late, and they want to know how they can influence those decisions. Secondly, Delawareans understand that the existing news and information ecosystem is not working for them. It's not meeting their needs. And this was really exciting to me as somebody who cares about this to realize that a lot of lay people understand it's not working and that we need something different. Unsolicited, without any prompting, a lot of the participants in the focus groups were asking about new models for journalism. They were saying, can it be nonprofit? Can it be like a utility? You know, we all need access to this stuff. And we know that it's not working, that we understand that it's the for-profit model that is driving it to clickbait and sensationalism. And that's not to say that there's not a place for for-profit media. They understand that there is, but they also understand that the current setup is not meeting all of the community's needs. And finally, we identified specific major gaps in coverage and access to information in Delaware. We were able to pin down geographic areas that lack coverage and access, as well as demographic communities, primarily, no surprise, Black and Latino communities. We also heard loud and clear that Delawareans need more information in 3 specific subject areas, and that is primarily government, public policy issues, education, and land use and development. So what's next? The assessment ends with a set of recommendations for how different stakeholder groups can help to address some of the gaps that we identified in the research, including setting forth some recommendations for grant makers. Because the recommendations are based on real research that engaged real people, the funders that we're talking to are much more excited and interested in these strategies that we're proposing. Right now, we're focused on 3 key strategies. One is that we are building a pipeline of local journalists from underrepresented communities, particularly communities of color. We're doing this through an internship program and several other strategies. We're kind of revamping that right now to figure out how we can be most effective with that. We're also advancing collaborative journalism in Delaware to strengthen the quality and the reach of local news and information, as well as to build up the community's trust in local news providers. And finally, we're working toward launching next year Spotlight Delaware, kind of in the model of Spotlight PA, Spotlight New Jersey, which will be a collaborative nonprofit newsroom to address the impact of public policy on communities throughout the state, with an emphasis on underserved and undercovered communities and issues that we identified in the research. So that's a little bit about, oh, did I miss it? I did, I missed one of the slides. Okay, that's all right, still got it. So that's a little bit about why my team at the DCF and these other generous funders chose to invest in our local news and information ecosystem assessment, as well as a quick overview of what we did, and an even quicker overview of how we're putting the findings to work. So I hope some of this information might be useful to you in your work, and I invite you to take a look at the whole report on our website, ljidelaware.org, or to contact me anytime. Thanks for your time for this.
That was a walk. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. How's everyone doing? Good. I'd love to hear it. All right. So my name is Leah Trusty. I'm a senior associate for the Public Square program at Democracy Fund. We're a private foundation based out of DC, working in democracy issues generally. And today I will be talking about funding journalism with an equity lens. Let's try this clicker. So just a quick outline of what I'll be talking about. So first, I'll be defining the moment, trying to set the scene for both our organization and the field of journalism overall. I'll be talking about what do we mean when we say funding equity in journalism, the what, the who, and the how. challenges and opportunities, and then, if we have time, Q&A, although I know we're all eager for a break. All right, so defining the moment. This past summer, my program team actually just completed a new round of strategic planning. And the guiding star that we landed on for this new round was that all communities see themselves, their needs, their concerns, their dreams, fully and authentically reflected in the public square, and that as a result, they're able to build and wield power to create a multiracial democracy in which we all thrive. So there are myriad challenges to actually reaching this guiding star, of course, but perhaps the most daunting one is the fact that historically journalism has either scapegoated, stereotyped, or altogether excluded historically marginalized communities, both within their newsrooms and in their storytelling practices. We know this isn't by mistake, but by design. Journalism doesn't just capture reality, it creates it, and in this way, media has played a significant role in the oppression of these communities. But just as we examine the history of journalism in this way in order to think about what a better future for it might look like, we need to examine philanthropy and how we have perpetuated historic inequities through the persistent underinvestment in these communities. So what does it look like to actually begin to right some of these wrongs? What does it look like to fund with an equity lens? So what do we mean when we talk about this work? For us, first, it begins with investing in news organizations led by and serving historically marginalized communities. Supporting organizations, coalitions, and individuals working to shift industry culture overall. And closing the historic resource gaps that philanthropy has helped to perpetuate. So what are we funding? When our program was first launched, we had a really heavy emphasis on investing in infrastructure and organizations supporting the news as opposed to the news themselves. There was a fear that investing in individual newsrooms would fail to transform the industry overall. And largely, the only exceptions to this ethos were larger white-led nonprofit news organizations. We still believe that infrastructure organizations play a really critical role in both our strategy and the industry as a whole, but we quickly realized that a lot of the practices that we wanted to see sort of spread throughout the field were being led by a lot of the same leaders and organizations that had been excluded from philanthropy. And these were folks who were collaborating, who were very eagerly sharing their models, lessons learned, things that they were struggling with. And this really sort of prompted the change for us. And just a few examples of what this work has looked like. Co-founding the Racial Equity in Journalism Fund with a few peer funders here, investing in the Pivot Fund led by Tracy Powell, who will be talking about that later. Outlier Media, which we've already heard a lot about because they are incredible and we should always be talking about them. And the New Mexico Local News Lab, which is, or Local News Fund, which is one of a few various ecosystem regions that we're investing in. Ooh, yes. So who are we funding? I think that it's been mentioned a few times already, but we're investing in organizations, but at the core of this work is people, right? So we want to be able to support the trailblazing leaders, oftentimes leaders of color, who are really pushing this industry to change. What has this looked like in the past? Ecosystem Builders, which is a program led by my amazing colleagues, Christine and Teresa, which is an ever-evolving group of local journalists who are really pushing to transform the industry, rooted in both community and collaboration. Executive and operations coaching, which is something that we've provided several of our grantee partners with over the past few years. But we've also sort of taken a step back and started investing more in the holistic health and wellness of journalists as well, and supporting organizations that are able to give to them directly, because unfortunately our structures don't allow for that as much quite yet. And some of this has looked like supporting IWMF's Black Journalist Therapy Relief Fund, which gives stipends to Black journalists and now journalists of color generally who are seeking mental health care. as well as the Unicorn Fund out of Media Democracy Fund, which gives stipends to under-resourced grassroots leaders. We really want to make sure that we're supporting these folks in the most creative ways possible. This work is still really growing and changing at Democracy Fund, but we're really excited to think about its next phase. And how are we funding? I think we all know that it's just as important to think about the ways in which we're funding when we talk about how we are using an equity lens to support journalism or really any industry. By decreasing the number of requirements of our grantee partners and institutionalizing flexibility, we hope that we're giving them more time and energy to actually do their work. So these are things that we've heard from our own partners in making these changes. So the first is general operating support whenever possible, and of course there are instances in which we're not able to do that for legal reasons, but that still leaves many, many grantees on the table. Shorter applications, which our amazing grants team has worked on over the past few years in both our initial application, but also an even shorter renewal form for grantees who've already gotten funding from us. Verbal reporting, so that's also been a newer thing, but we've already gotten a lot of really great feedback about that. And wellness stipends. So that is a new initiative that we've launched across several parts of the organization to give grantee partners anywhere from $15,000 to $25,000 on top of the grant that we've already given them, and this can go towards anything that they define as wellness. It's still really early days for this work, but we've already heard folks seeking coaching, going to team dinners, staff retreats. I'm really excited to see the other creative ways that folks are thinking about using these dollars. So the challenge. So there are myriad challenges when it comes to doing this work. I think we're familiar with a lot of them. So, hoarding resources, gatekeeping power and decision-making processes, both sidesism, bottlenecking processes that keep resources from going to the places where they're needed most, when they're needed most. But truly underlying all of these issues, I believe, and maybe the most critical one, is that philanthropy as an institution only exists because of historic inequities. And at its worst, it reinforces white supremacist hierarchies that allows it to exist in the first place. That can be very tough to name and grapple with, but it's the truth, it's the water in which we're all swimming, and it's why I think we continue to struggle to change, even though, we've made a lot of efforts around, our DEI committees and, fixing our applications and putting out numerous reports about why this work is really critical. That's a layered issue, right? And it's very challenging to scale. And I think it's a struggle to transform the industry of journalism because we are still struggling to transform ourselves as a field. But there's an opportunity. There's always an opportunity. That's a daunting challenge, but I think the opportunity today is what it's always been, and that is people. People in this room who are pushing for change in their organizations and in the field of philanthropy. People in this room who are centering their communities in all of their storytelling practices. The people who care enough about us and our work to actually hold us accountable to the things that we say that we're doing to become better. And finally, and always, the Black people, the Indigenous people, Latina people, all people of color, women, LGBTQ folks, and anyone living at the intersections of these communities and other marginalized communities who've always shown up when we haven't and when the people who were supposed to be supporting them didn't. These are the folks who have always loved on their communities, who have been working so hard to build bridges between them and to create and dream up really exciting futures in which they and all of us can thrive. And I truly believe that philanthropy as a whole will be able to do this work best when we invest in them, when we partner with them, and when we cede our power to them. Thank you.